November 1943. Near Kiev, Ukraine. The cold air bit into my face as I stood in the trench, rifle in hand, watching the horizon. The once bright skies over Ukraine had turned into a murky, endless grey, matching the mood of our entire unit. We were supposed to be advancing, pushing deeper into Soviet territory, but here we were stuck. Kiev, once a prize we had captured in 1941, was now a nightmare. The mud caked everything. Our boots sank into it with every step, making even the simplest movement exhausting. I looked at the men around me. Some were my comrades from the early days of the campaign, others were replacements, young boys who looked more frightened than fierce. The older ones, like myself, had long since lost that gleam of pride that came with being part of the Waffen-SS. Now, our faces were as grey and tired as the skies above us. We were no longer the soldiers of the Blitzkrieg, striking fast and merciless. We were now defenders, digging in, waiting for the inevitable Soviet onslaught. Our supplies were running thin. The food rations had shrunk to tasteless bits of bread, and ammunition was carefully counted before every patrol. We had to hold this line, we were told. Orders from higher command. But those orders came with little context, and with even less hope. Rumors were circulating among the men, whispers of a massive Soviet offensive coming our way. We didn't know when, but we knew it was coming. Some said it would be tomorrow, others said within the week. We felt it in the air, the tension growing with every passing hour. The Soviets had been regrouping for weeks, their artillery growing louder in the distance, their planes patrolling the skies far more frequently than before. I wiped the mud off my helmet, staring at the horizon as the wind picked up, cutting through my uniform like ice. The silence between artillery strikes was unsettling. The Soviet bombardments had become routine, and the longer the silence dragged on, the more anxious we became. Every man in the trench was waiting for the next explosion, the next rush of enemy soldiers pouring toward our lines. Kiev was still miles behind us, but it didn't feel that way. The city had been overrun weeks ago, and now we were stretched thin, forced to defend positions that we didn't have the manpower to hold. There were no reserves, no reinforcements coming to save us. We were on our own. The realization weighed heavily on all of us. In the distance, I could see a thin line of smoke rising from the trees of a farmhouse, probably burning, left behind as Soviet scouts moved closer. I wasn't sure what they were waiting for. Part of me wished they'd just get it over with. The waiting was worse than the fighting. At least in battle, there was some clarity, some purpose. In moments like these, all I had were my thoughts, and they were not comforting. I thought of home, of the promises we were given when the war started. Victory would be swift, they said. We would crush the Soviets before the winter of 1941, they promised. 2 winters later, and here we were, freezing in the mud, waiting for an enemy that refused to be crushed. Suddenly, a distant explosion echoed through the cold air. I looked up, my hand tightening on my rifle. Another explosion followed, closer this time. Then another. The men around me stirred, their eyes wide, their bodies tensing. The Soviets were testing our lines again, probing for weaknesses. The roar of artillery filled the air. The Soviet shells screamed as they landed, sending dirt and debris flying into the trench. My heart raced. This was it. They were coming. As I crouched down in the trench, waiting for the enemy to appear through the smoke and fire, I realized just how far we had fallen. We had been the victors once. Now, we were just survivors, clinging to a line that was crumbling with every passing day. The offensive had stalled, and with it, our hope. The war wasn't ending, it was only getting worse. Near Bila Tserkva, Ukraine. The sound of screaming filled the air. Men were crying out for medics, others yelling commands, but none of it made sense anymore. It was like being in the middle of a storm, and all you could do was try to hold your ground, hoping the storm would pass. But this one didn't. I glanced to my right. 2 of my comrades were trying to set up a machine gun in the mud, their hands shaking from the cold and the fear. Before they could get it operational, a shell landed just meters away from them, sending a blast of dirt and fire into the air. When the dust settled, they were gone. The Soviets attacked at dawn. We were barely awake when the first barrage of artillery hit. The ground shook beneath us, sending dust and rocks into the air. In an instant, everything turned to chaos. I scrambled out of my shelter, my rifle in hand, as the shells kept falling, louder and closer with each passing second. I could see them now, just over the ridge, their dark silhouettes moving quickly through the smoke. The Soviet soldiers, hunched low and advancing in small groups, looked like shadows in the early morning light. Their uniforms blended into the snow-covered landscape, making them hard to spot at first, but once they got closer, their numbers became clear. There were so many of them. The Soviet tactic was brutal, but effective. They softened us up with their artillery, pounding our positions into the mud, and then they sent in the infantry wave after wave of men. As soon as the barrage stopped, I heard the familiar roar of Soviet tanks rumbling forward, their engines growling like beasts on the hunt. I knew what was coming next, the flood of soldiers that always followed the tanks, charging toward us, bayonets fixed, yelling like madmen. "Hold the line," an officer yelled behind me, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. We cannot retreat. The sound of gunfire drowned out his words, but we knew what he meant. There was nowhere to retreat to. If we gave up this position, we would be overrun. I took aim and fired, squeezing the trigger without thinking, letting my training take over. The Soviets kept coming, stumbling over the bodies of their comrades as they rushed toward us. It felt like shooting into a storm. No matter how many fell, more appeared. It was as if the ground itself was spitting them out. I ducked into the trench as bullets zipped past my head. The roar of engines grew louder, and I could feel the heat from the tank's exhaust as it passed over our position. Another explosion shook the earth, and I felt something hot and sharp tear into my leg. Pain shot through me, but I forced myself to keep moving, crawling through the mud, trying to find cover. The line was breaking. I could see it happening in real time. Men were falling back, running for their lives, while others stayed in place, firing blindly into the smoke. We had held out for as long as we could, but the Red Army was overwhelming us. Their numbers were endless, their resolve unbreakable. The Soviet tanks reached our line first, their steel treads grinding over the bodies of the dead and the dying. The earth trembled under their weight. I saw a Panzer IV in the distance, one of the last we had left, taking aim at the nearest Soviet tank. Its cannon fired, sending a plume of smoke into the air, but the shot missed, hitting the ground just in front of the advancing enemy. The Soviet tank didn't slow down. Through the haze, I saw one of our officers stand up, waving his arm in the air, trying to rally the men. "Counterattack," he shouted. Counterattack now, but his words fell on deaf ears. Most of us were too shocked, too broken by the relentless assault, to respond. The red tide had arrived, and it was sweeping us away. I tried to stand, but my leg gave out, the pain too intense to ignore now. I looked around, desperate for some sign of hope, some way out of this nightmare, but there was nothing. Just fire, smoke, and death. December 1943. I stared at the snow-covered field ahead, my breath turning to mist in the air. Somewhere out there, beyond the smoke and trees, the Soviets were regrouping. It was only a matter of time before they came at us again, this time with more force, more tanks, more men. We were stretched so thin, I wondered how long we could keep holding on. An officer entered the room, his face gaunt and pale from the cold. "We're falling back to the river," he said without preamble. "There's no use holding this position any longer. We've been ordered to regroup with what's left of the battalion." I remember sitting by the river one night, staring into the flames of a small fire we had managed to light. The orange glow flickered weakly in the cold air. The others were quiet, lost in their own thoughts, but I could feel the weight of their despair. We had been through too much, seen too many comrades fall, and yet the war dragged on, with no mercy for anyone. As we gathered our things, I could hear the distant rumble of Soviet artillery in the distance, slowly closing in on us. The retreat had to be fast. We moved quickly, abandoning our makeshift shelters and heading out into the open. The snow crunched under our boots as we trudged toward the river, the wind howling around us like some angry, unseen force. The temperature seemed to drop even lower, biting through our coats, making every movement a struggle. Regroup. The word felt hollow. There wasn't much left to regroup with. I glanced around at the men, exhausted, starving, on the edge of collapse. But we had no choice. Orders were orders. We couldn't stay here and wait to be overrun. By the time we reached the other side, we were a shell of the unit we had been just days before. Cold, hungry, broken, but still alive for now. The retreat had saved us from immediate death, but it felt like a hollow victory. We had lost more ground, more men, and the Soviets were still advancing. The next few days passed in a blur. The fighting continued, sporadic and vicious, but our spirits were shattered. There was no end in sight. The Red Army's determination was unrelenting, their tactics growing more brutal with each passing day. They pushed us further and further back, like a relentless tide, sweeping everything before them. We made it to the river by nightfall, the black ribbon of water snaking through the frozen landscape like some foreboding barrier. Crossing it was treacherous, the ice cracking under our weight, threatening to give way at any moment. Some of us didn't make it. 2 men fell through, swallowed by the freezing water beneath the ice. Their screams echoed in the darkness for a moment before they were silenced. The Battle of Bila Tserkva had broken us. We had been holding the line for so long, but now it was clear the Soviets were winning. No matter how hard we fought, how many of their soldiers we gunned down, their sheer numbers and resolve were impossible to overcome. We were being pushed out of Ukraine, step by agonizing step. January 1944. Outskirts of Bila Tserkva, Ukraine. The winter had tightened its grip. Snow blanketed everything, turning the battlefield into a frozen wasteland. What had once been churned up mud and blood was now a hard, icy crust beneath our boots. The temperature plunged so low that it hurt to breathe, the cold biting into our skin like needles. Even in our winter gear, the chill seeped through. We could hardly feel our fingers or toes anymore, but the fighting didn't stop. I stared out at the dark horizon, the faint rumble of artillery still echoing in the distance, and wondered how much longer I could survive this hell. The Soviets had taken most of our positions by now. We were barely holding onto the outskirts of Bila Tserkva. Each day brought new waves of attacks, and each day we fell back a little further. The Red Army seemed endless. It didn't matter how many of them we killed, they just kept coming, swarming us like locusts, determined to push us out of Ukraine. Every new morning brought with it a fresh assault, as if they never tired, never wavered in their determination. It never stopped. I sat in what used to be a farmhouse, now reduced to rubble, with the rest of my squad. There were only 6 of us left. The others had either been killed, wounded, or had simply vanished in the chaos of battle. The air smelled of gunpowder and smoke, a bitter reminder of the destruction that surrounded us. We hadn't eaten in days, and our supplies were running low. Even the water in our canteens had frozen solid. It was quiet, unnervingly so. The lull in the fighting was brief but agonizing. We all knew it wouldn't last. The silence before the storm was sometimes worse than the battle itself. It gave us time to think, to reflect on how little was left of us. "Do you think we'll make it out of here?" one of the men asked. His voice was low, as if he didn't want the words to carry. None of us answered.